Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Fortier. I'm the director of the Beekman Library. I've been there for 12 years, and prior to that, I worked at the Poughkeepsie Public Library District as a youth services librarian. And then in my former life, I actually was in retail sales management for about 8 years. And I'm going to let Julie introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Julie Kelsall-Dempsey. I'm the director of the Highland Public Library. I've been the director since 1996. I started in I started in the children's department as well. Then when the director left, I was put into this position. We're a school district public library. Our population is about 12,514 as of the 2010 census. So we'll see what that means. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I should say, actually, Julie is, her library is a civil service library. My library is an association library, and I'm not civil service. And so Julie will be taking care of all of the civil service details today that I am not well versed in. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that Julie and I are sharing our experiences and what we've learned. Many things may be the hard way we've learned them through years. And so collectively, what we've learned about human resources and how to kind of build your own department in your library. But we want to emphasize that we are not labor lawyers. We're not insurance agents. We're not people who are professionals in human resources. So if you at any point have questions in your library, you need to make sure that you seek out information from those professionals. And actually, that's a great segue into what we're going to talk about next, because the very first thing that I want to talk about is the professional team that you're going to assemble in your library, so that you feel that even though the title of this was when you are the HR department, really what the goal is for you to assemble a team so that you don't feel alone, so that you have people that can work with you and help you when you're trying to make decisions in your library about human resources. So this slide just shows all of the different members of the team that Julie and I feel are important. You may have some other people that and some other organizations that you go to, and that's great. And maybe at the end we can even share some of that information. Things like listservs where you get information about laws being updated, that type of thing. But these are the basic members of the team: the board personnel committee, your civil service office, the attorney that you use for your library, your insurance agent, bookkeeper or payroll service, and your library system. Now, I just ran through those really quickly because we're going to spend actually a lot of time on each one in detail. So the I'm having a little bit of a time. There we go. Okay. So the board personnel committee may vary by library, and I know Julie is going to share a little bit about her library too when I finish, because we did find some differences in how we handle our board personnel committee. My board personnel committee consists of 3 trustees, and the things that they work on with me is when I have a new position, I need to make a new hire. They are not part of the hiring process really, but I do share the information with them. I share who the different candidates are and what my decision is. And then they're the ones that present it to the board at our board meeting for appointment. In terms of evaluations, my board committee evaluates me. I'm the only person that they actually evaluate, but I do share with them the evaluations that I do on my staff. So that they are aware of where people are in their development and are aware of whether or not there's any issues with the staff. And that has changed through the years. Sometimes my personnel committee wants to be more involved in that, and sometimes they don't. The terminations is definitely something that you would always go to your personnel committee, and so that you have partners when you're making those decisions. So they would definitely be involved in that. And then the final thing that my board personnel committee works on is determining how new laws will impact our benefits and our policies, and then helping kind of shape that and make decisions about what changes we're going to make and what types of things are going to need to be in the policies. And then it gets handed off to the policy committee for actually writing up that policy. But they're the ones that I go to. For instance, this year we've had so many changes, right? With COVID, and then also with the sick leave that just came through. So that was something that I had to get together with my board personnel committee to make decisions about how it was going to impact our benefits, what changes we were going to make, and then we handed it off to the policy committee to write it up. So Julie, did you want to share a few things about your committee and how yours works?
Sure. It's very similar to yours. Ours is basically 2 board members and myself. They do the appointing of new positions, just as Carol. In fact, there's a form I now use that I basically borrowed from the Poughkeepsie Library District, just to make it easier. They are obviously, when I'm going to hire, I need to make sure that they approve of me hiring someone because it's a budgetary item. They do not evaluate staff. They will start the evaluation process for myself, but then the whole board will do an evaluation of me, and then they'll work together on that. And when it comes to terminations with civil service is done if you're competitive, which most positions in libraries are competitive. It has to be done with the rule of 3, which we will get to much later. So that they are obviously involved in, and so is our attorney. If there were ever, I have not had to go through that process, but if there were, that would definitely be done with the full board and our attorney. So I think, and then our personnel policy is also our policy. It's our personnel committee is also our policy committee. So they do update our policy.
That's convenient.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the next organization that's part of your team is this slide is actually Julie's, because I, as I said, do not have experience with civil service. So Julie is going to cover what the position, what kind of relationship you want to have with your civil service office.
Yeah, and it's very important to have a good working relationship with your civil service. In my experience, they are more than, excuse me, willing to make sure that your library is in compliance and work with you to keep your library in compliance and get your library there. We've had in the past in Ulster, when I first started, it was not as tight as it is now. And so there were positions created that really needed to be tightened up through the years, and civil service worked with every library in Ulster County to get them to be in compliance. So they basically classify and determine every position in your library. So you cannot, if you want to hire someone for a library clerk, you need to make sure that you have an open library clerk position. If you don't, then you have to fill out a new duty statement, which include, and I'll probably get into that more in the hiring aspect actually, so we'll get into that later. But you have to fill out forms, send it to civil service, and that would include the job description, the tasks involved, salary, and whatever. They would then create that position, and they would classify it, whether it was exempt, non-exempt, labor class, permanent, competitive, or non-competitive. And most library positions are competitive, except for your labor, which is not, or part-time. So, and those are then filled mainly with an examination. The exam can be either questions, multiple choice, or in the case in Ulster County, and for library one, I think it's through the state, and library director, it's training and experience test, T&E. And like I said, most positions are competitive, and we'll get into more about the hiring details later on in this presentation. So I don't want to get into that too much right now.
I do have a question for you though, Julie, with regard to this. When into your relationship with the people at civil service, do you have a set person that you talk to most of the time, or?
Yes. Yeah, we do. There's two that I usually talk to, and it's just working with them. At the county level, we actually strive to make sure that we all were working well with civil service, so we invited them to county meetings so they could get to know us and we could get to know them. So there's two people that I am in contact with that oversee libraries.
So if you have questions or concerns, or if you were a new director that really wasn't familiar with civil service, the way that you'd be able to make sure you were following.
Yeah, yes, you should be able to just contact your civil service office and explain the situation, or reach out to another library in your area, in your county or whatever, that is a civil service, and they would be able to get you the name and the contact information, hopefully, of the person that you should contact.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the next person on your team, and this is a very important person on your team, is your attorney for your library. And I didn't put it on the slide, but it is really important that your attorney be someone who's very well versed in labor law, because although the library may need an attorney for lots of different things, one of the biggest things that you need to be concerned about in your library is that excuse me, that you're following all of the labor laws, and that if you get into a situation where somebody has a complaint about harassment, or a complaint about a termination they think that was not justified, you want to make sure that your attorney is going to be somebody who can really help you with the details of that. So that's something that helps you when you're selecting an attorney. The things that you might use an attorney for, and the reason why they're important to have them on your team, is things like a workers' compensation claim. I mean, certainly if you have a workers' compensation claim, if a staff member does, they are going to be going through the insurance company that handles your workers' compensation claims. But if you're ever in a situation where you're concerned that maybe there's going to be a lawsuit involved, then those are things that definitely you want to speak to the attorney early and make sure that they're aware of what's going on, and they can kind of advise you how to proceed to hopefully de-escalate things. Also, anytime that you're concerned, obviously, about a lawsuit, any kind of a lawsuit, you want to bring the attorney in. And I can't stress enough bringing them in at the beginning of the situation. It's not helpful to an attorney to be in a situation where they're trying to play catch up. They need to be aware of what's going on early in the process so they can help you and advise you. And definitely that applies to terminations. If you're ever considering terminating an employee, and when you're in the counseling stages, that's when you would want to bring the attorney into the loop so that they know what's going on with this person. And again, they can certainly advise you for the best way to proceed. Anytime you have questions about new labor laws, like we had this year, right? We had so many different changes with COVID. I know I had to speak to my attorney about the quarantine situation, whether the New York state law applied or if it was the federal law that applied, and what role the library had to, what rules we had to follow. So anytime that there's changes in labor laws, if you have questions, that's who you need to go to. Also, Julie had brought up that her attorney always reviews her personnel policies, and so does mine. And that's a great way to make sure that you're covered and that you have the information in your policy manual, and that you are doing things the right way, and that you're doing best practices, really, is what you're trying to do. So again, I can't stress enough making sure that the attorney's brought in nice and early in the process. The next member of the team might not necessarily be somebody you would think of, but your insurance agent. It's important to have a good relationship with your insurance agent as well. And because the insurance agent can help you, just like the attorney helps you with risk to the library, an insurance agent can do the same thing. And now, obviously, they're helping you with all kinds of risk to the library, but they can help you also specifically with risk that are related to human resources. Some of the kinds of things that you might want to think about whether you have coverage for, and that you could question your insurance agent, because I know that none of us are insurance experts either. You know, looking through those insurance policies, you can read them, and then when you're done, you still don't know what your coverage is because they're so confusing. At least that's my experience. So you want to talk to your agent, and the kinds of things you might need coverage for are things like if you have staff members that do errands for the library with their own car. or even if a staff member is going to training and they're driving with their own car, you need to make sure, see if that's enough of a risk that you want to make sure that you have auto. It's called non-owned auto coverage. And that is a way to make sure that the library is protected in case a staff member gets into an accident while they're on library business, because their insurance might not cover. And certainly if they were in the fault, if it was their fault, the accident, then the library could be sued by the other person in the accident. So that's something you want to discuss with an insurance agent. Another thing that you might want coverage for are employment practices coverage, which covers you if things are done incorrectly, whether benefits are administered incorrectly or there was a problem with the way the paycheck deductions were made, those kinds of things, if you want to make sure that you're covered for that as well. And depending on the size of your library, there may be other coverage that you need as well. And again, it's really good to have a good relationship with your insurance agent. We actually just changed insurance agents for this reason, because I felt that the previous company we were working with really was not looking at our library and our situation and advising us and giving us the information that we need. And really that's what you're, that's why you go to them. It's they're getting paid. And so they need to be advising you and making sure that you have the coverage that you need to minimize the risk. The next person on this team that you're going to build is either your bookkeeper or, depending on your library structure, it may also be a payroll service. It just so happens that I use a bookkeeper and Julie uses a payroll service, so it works out good. You'll get a little bit of both. But for me, the bookkeeper is the one that calculates the paid time that staff is owed. She's the one that's going to be dealing with this accrued sick time that we need to now do through New York State. When somebody comes in that's eligible for health insurance, she's the one that kind of helps get them signed up for that, helps them if they have questions about the tax documents they have to fill out when they're hired. And she would be the one they would go to if they had a question about a deduction in their paycheck, or how many more hours they have left of paid time if they have questions about that. She's the one that takes care of that, but I always try to make sure that she knows when she needs to refer them to me, because if the question is specific to a paycheck and deductions, then she's the person to answer it, because she's the one that does those calculations. But if the question starts moving into what their benefits are and what benefits they're entitled to, that's when she knows that she needs to refer them to me. That's how we handle it at my library. But Julie, I know you use a payroll service, so how does that work?
Yeah, we use ADP right now. They do time tracking. Well, it's separate, but we do time tracking, which includes scheduling and the payroll. We used to do a bookkeeper. And then several years ago, when our bookkeeper was retiring, we decided to go this route. And the one thing I really like about it is the direct deposit aspect of it, which we encourage staff to do, but it is not mandatory. So I have a couple that still receive a check, which during COVID was a little more tricky for them. So the ADP handles the deductions. They will help staff if there's questions. Staff can contact them, or I will contact them on behalf of staff. They set up any of the deductions that have to be taken care of. If there's anything that needs to be explained, I send them our policy on vacation and sick time and holidays, and all that information gets sent to them, and then they have it set up every year that it automatically renews based on our policy. So as long as they have the policy, they take care of all that aspect of it. They don't do our medical insurance anymore. We did 1 year, but it's easier. It's an additional cost. It's not included like the workers' comp and the disability. So I stopped doing that. We did only a year because of the cost involved. So we have, what else do we do? I think that's it. Basically whatever Carol's bookkeeper does, ADP tends to do for us.
And so it's just a matter of you making sure they have the policies, right?
Yeah, they do. And then when it comes to the paycheck, sorry, I left my train of thought. When it comes to payroll, I'm the one who will go in and verify everyone's time card before I send the paychecks in for them to process. And then they send the New York State tax and, you know, the quarterly taxes and all that stuff. But I am the one who verifies hours, make sure everybody has the right time, and then process the payroll.
Okay, great. So if I ever decide to switch to a service, I'll be calling you.
Yeah, I like that. We're with Paychecks, but ADP gave us a better rate, so we switched over.
Okay, all right. Okay, and then the final members of your team is your library system. And this was something Julie and I talked about, that, you know, every system is different in terms of maybe the services that they are providing. But so what we're sharing is what's the case in our system. Julie and I are in 2 different counties, our libraries, but we are part of the same system. We're part of the Mid-Hudson Library System. So one of the things they definitely provide us with is up-to-date information relating to labor laws. They frequently send out emails in relation to this. They'll do workshops on this if there are a lot of changes, like there were this year, so that it's not the full picture necessarily, but they give you enough information so you know what you need to work on, and then you go to those other professionals as well, like your attorney, to make sure that you're doing things properly. They also provide us with comparable information in the system related to benefits and salaries. Now, that's thing that might be unique to our system. I know Julie is on the committee that requests that they do that. They do a survey of members of member libraries, and then that information is shared with us, which is great because it gives you information so that you know whether or not you're being competitive in your size library. And I think the next thing is the same way, that they also provide a compilation of those annual reports that to the state that we all love to do, where we fill out our FTEs and the salaries for directors and our total personnel cost. They compile that information so that we can view it on the system website. And again, that's a great way to know whether or not you're being competitive and you can compare yourself to like-size libraries. And that information I find also can be helpful to your personnel committee when you're discussing with them new hires and starting salaries and things like that. This is the information you can share with them so that you can make a good decision. So that's it for your team. And now what we're going to talk about is some of the other things that you might do in your library on a day-to-day basis that are related to human resources. The most obvious one, of course, is new hires. And it's before you even post a job, right? You have to have a description of the job. So I have 2 different things at my library. I have a job description and a position description. I think the terminology is different in civil service because I noticed on some of Julie's documents, I think civil service uses position in a different way than I'm using it. So I'll just share with you how I do it. You're also going to have in the packet that Christina talked about handouts, and it'll show you an example of how I use a job description versus a position. For me, a job description is generic to the job that someone is doing, i.e. library clerk. It's a generic job description about what qualifications a library clerk needs to have, what duties would be the normal duties that a library clerk would do, so that someone applying for a job can make a decision about whether or not they think that they would be good for that job. A position description is specific to an individual and includes responsibilities that they might have that are unique to them. So for instance, if I have a clerk, everybody who's a clerk does certain things, but maybe only one clerk works on overdues and handling overdues, and maybe another clerk works on feeding new books into the collection after 6 months. So those go in their position descriptions so that everybody knows really what their responsibilities are. But you would want to have those. You definitely need the job description before you do a new hire. And as far as interview prep, what I mean by that is that you want to make sure that you've really spent some time reading over the application and or the resume, and that if there's things in it that are a red flag for you or things that are interesting to you, that you make a note of those so that you can ask the applicant when you get into that interview. But Julie and I did both agree that candidates for the same job the questions, the majority of the questions that you're asking should be the same questions, because that gives you a better way to make sure that you're really comparing them on an equal playing field. But you may have individual questions based on a particular person's background that you maybe are curious about. The other thing that's really important with new hires, obviously, is to make sure that you know the law, what's legal and what is illegal to ask. I'm not going to get into all of that here, but again, there is a handout that lists what questions are illegal to ask. And it is important to remember that sometimes the applicant will steer the interview into an area that really is illegal when they maybe start talking about their family or things like that. And that can still get you into trouble, even if you didn't ask the question. So it's important to make sure that you steer the interview back to those questions that you want to focus on. And then the final part of new hiring, of course, is knowing the civil service requirements. And again, as you know now, this is going to go over to Julie, the next slide, because Julie's going to cover civil service hiring.
Yeah, so the open position must exist in the library, which we touched on before. So if it doesn't, if it's a new position, like recently I added a marketing person. And so you have to fill out a new duty statement with civil service where you put in the job description, the salary, how many hours a week it's going to be, what requirements, what skills, what education, tasks, duties, everything, and then you send that to civil service, and they will classify that and let you know the title of that job, of that position, the position number, and whether it's competitive, non-competitive, and then you can start recruiting for it. So then the next step is, if it is a competitive position, you need to hire from the Certificate of Eligibles, the COE. You would request that list from civil service. You could either do it for your in Ulster, we could do it countywide, or if I just wanted to hire someone local, I could request just our local school district COE. It depends on what you're looking to do, but you have that option. Once you get that, you have to canvass the top 3 ranking, which means the top 3 people, and then anyone else who is tied in rank with that number 3 person. So if that number 3 person had an 80 score, anyone else who has an 80 score qualifies in the top 3, and you can canvass them as well. Your canvass letter should include at the bottom of it a declination statement from the person, because if they decline to be interviewed by you, they have to sign that, and you have to return that to civil service. On the COE, you have to fill out every action that was taken for every person that you did interview, and why you did not interview them, especially for their top 3. So you want to make sure you have everything in writing and everything back. Once you send the canvas letter, the person has 7 business days to respond, either to set up an interview or to get that letter back to you. If it's not a competitive, then you would just place an ad and recruit. Once you hired someone, you would send the application resume to civil service, and they will sign off on that once your board has appointed the person. If there is no list, if there's a position, usually this sometimes happens with, not so much with library clerks or clerks, but with librarian positions, library assistant positions, there's not always a list. So if there is not a list, you can hire, but that position will be provisional. If it's competitive, it'll be a provisional appointment until such time as an exam is given. And then once it is given, that person has to fall into the top 3 ranking. And that's where it may work to your advantage, or to that person's advantage, to just request the COE for your area if that person tends to live in the same area. So I think that's everything. So, but like I said, it's a lot of paperwork. Everything gets sent to civil service for their, and they keep track of everything. So.
Okay. All right. Well, you make me happy. I'm not a civil service.
Yeah.
Boy. Okay. The next step after you've made that new hire, whether you're a civil service library or not, is the onboarding. And this is something that I feel really strongly about, that this is the way that you can make sure that people succeed at your library. And so it's really important that you think about this really carefully. You don't want any of this to be just sort of an afterthought. You hired the person and you breathe a sigh of relief because you got that position, covered. You need to make sure that it's really a good onboarding process for the new hire. So the training really needs to be formal. You don't want it to just be an afterthought. You want to have a training that is structured, and that you want to make sure that they have time for the training. Julie and I both talked about the fact that, we don't hire somebody and then just throw them on the desk and say, oh, just shadow this person. That's not training. Training needs to be that they're coming in specifically to only learn the job, and they're not actually covering anything. And so that's, I feel, again, and I know sometimes that can be hard to do if you're short-staffed and if you're a small library, but I can't stress enough how important it is. It's also important to think about who's going to do the training, depending on the position, because the person that does the training, it usually, the new trainee sort of bonds with that trainer. And that's who they're going to tend to go to when they have questions or concerns. And they're also going to frequently model the behavior. And so you want to make sure that the person who's doing that training is really who you want them to be modeling. So that's something also to think about. Another thing that's real important is clear expectations. If you have a probationary period, you need to make sure that that's explained to a new hire and that they're very clear on it. And I know Julie later will be discussing the probationary period in civil service and how it applies there. At my library, it's generally just a 3-month probationary period. And because we are an association library, that's kind of our decision to make. But you want to make sure that staff know that, new hires know that. I always give them a copy of the evaluation form so they know exactly what they're going to be evaluated on and what the expectations are. I also would give them a copy of the job and the position descriptions, again, for the same reason, because you want to make sure the expectations are very clear. An organizational chart. Now, I know that this is, some of the libraries that are listening to this are probably very small libraries, and they're probably laughing about the idea of an organizational chart, but my library is not very big either. I only have 12 people on staff, but it is important that people understand who's in charge. Obviously they know the director is the director, right? But then where does it go from there? If the director's not in, who's in charge then? Can a senior clerk tell a clerk to do something, or is that not part of their job description? Are they not supervising people? So you really need to make sure that people understand what the structure of your organization is, even if you feel like, well, we're small and we have kind of a loose structure. Well, yes, and that's fine, but people still want to know, because you can avoid confusion and misunderstandings if people understand exactly who is in charge in a given situation. And then the final thing, Julie and I both use a training checklist. We use different, our training checklists are a little different. They are also included in the packet. But my checklist, I actually have staff, the new hire, sign off on the checklist, because that's where they're basically saying that, yes, they got copies of the policy, that they went through this training, and that goes into their personnel file. So I use it that way. And there will be a sample of that in your packet. And as I said, Julie later will discuss the probationary period and how it works there. The next slide has to do actually with that training checklist, and Julie's going to share how she does hers as well. But my checklist, it's not just to have documentation that the staff member received everything. It's also to help me and whoever's doing the training to make sure that they, covered everything. And so it even has boring things on it, like, paperwork. Did we do the tax documents? Did we do the I-9? Did they get a copy of the benefits? Do they understand their benefits? Did they get a copy of the policy and procedure manual? Do they know how to access it? We do a library tour and that's when they get to meet the staff. And you can also do trustee introductions, maybe at a board meeting. I also do a website tour. I like to actually take time and sit down with the new hire and make sure that they go through the website and then give them some time to explore it themselves, because you can learn a lot about the library and the services that are provided, and that's going to be their job, right, is to make sure that they're sharing those services. So the website tour is an important part of our training. And then there's, of course, going to be things that are specific to the position that they're applying for. If it's a clerk position, it's going to be different than if you're hiring a head of youth services. So those things would vary. Julie, do you want to share a little bit, like, do you have other things on your checklist than what I have here?
No, I think the everything except we also have the code of ethics included in that, and I go over, you know, what's expected privacy-wise with patrons. And as we do a handbook that I give them that has everything in the handbook. I put a binder together that has everything, and I do have them sign off on our checklist as well. And like you, it's a reminder to make sure I cover everything that the person needs to know when we do it, and we set them up to succeed, not to fail, which is why we want to make sure that we check in with them and make sure they understand what it is that's expected of them right from the beginning. And our probationary period, in keeping with civil service in Ulster County, can be a minimum of 12 weeks or a maximum of 52, and ours is 52 weeks. And during that time, that's the only time in civil service that you can terminate an employee without going through the rule of three. We'll get into the rule of three.
Okay. Right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's the onboarding. So you've made a new hire and you've done a great job giving them a good start. And then the next thing that's really important is that you have feedback, that you have ongoing feedback with staff. And communication, I'm a big believer that it really needs to be immediate. I know that frequently, you know, nobody really likes confrontation, and speaking to somebody about something that they're maybe not doing properly, or usually it's frequently, at least the issues that I might have would be like a customer service issue, the way that they're dealing with patrons. It really needs to be immediate, even though as I said, I know it's uncomfortable, but that's the way that you make sure that, again, that people understand expectations and that they're given an opportunity to improve. It's not fair to people to just let things go, and then you sit down with an evaluation and now you're basically telling them that, you know, everything you've been doing for the last 6 months, I've had a problem with. You know, that's not fair to people. People can't succeed that way. So you really need to make sure that that communication is ongoing. And the form of communication, I think that it needs to be specific to the situation. You know, Julie and I also talked about the fact that, you know, you praise in public, and you know, you reprimand or discipline or counsel or whatever you want to call it in private. That's not something that should be done in front of other people. The goal is never to embarrass people. It's to help them, again, to succeed. So you want to share that information with them. I think that I use email for things that are very generic, things that I want to make sure people know. Sometimes email is a great way to make sure that you've told everybody, and that you know, you think maybe you have a small staff and you think, oh, well, I'll just make sure that I tell each person the next time they work. But the problem with that is then something happens and then you forget, and then one person on your staff doesn't know and everybody else does. And again, that causes confusion, and nobody likes to feel like I'm the one that didn't know something new, a new policy that is taking effect. So email is a good way to make sure that there's a paper trail that you've actually told everybody. Julie actually has something she's going to talk about in a little bit that she uses for communication that I'm excited about because I want to learn a little bit more about it. But the next part of feedback, obviously, is counseling, which is not a fun part of feedback. It's a lot more fun to be telling people that they're doing a great job. But I believe that counseling, you know, the first conversation you have with somebody, you can just maybe make notes, and it doesn't need to be signed. But if you speak to somebody more than once about something, I believe it should be documented and it should be signed. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but you want something in writing, and you want to make sure that the staff member knows. and that their signatures on there, and that's helpful to you if there should ever be an issue where you do need to terminate somebody. You want to make sure you have that. Julie, later when we talk about terminations, will tell you a little bit more about how civil service works with that, because they have very specific requirements. This requirement I'm sharing with you is my personal requirement. That's the way that I like to handle it. As far as meetings, I think the most important thing about meetings is meetings should be fun. There should be some training involved in it. They should it should help build the camaraderie in your staff. If you have a meeting and all you're doing is you are talking the entire time, that's probably not a very good meeting. There should be something where where it's interactive and people are learning something new. If all you're doing is sharing, okay, here's a new policy, here's a new thing we're going to do, that, and you're just like talking, you could probably share that in a different way that would be more effective. And again, if you're a small library, in my library, when I do meetings, because of our hours, I mean, we're open almost all the time. So I have to do a meeting at like 8:30 in the morning, and then I'm bringing in part-timers that don't work on their day off to come into a meeting. I want to make sure that it's something that they get something out of it. And then evaluations, of course, is another form of feedback, and it's something that we're going to go into a little bit more detail about. But Julie, I know that you were going to talk about
I have a couple of
form of communication here, right?
Yep. Yeah. So during COVID, I was trying to come up with a way to keep in touch with my staff while we were working remotely, and we found Slack works very well for us. It cuts down on the emails we need, and some of you may be familiar with it. As a nonprofit public library, it's free for us. It's great because we always like things that are free for us, and it just is easier because we can break everything down, whether it's programs, something, website, newsletter, whatever. It's a chat in Slack, and then you just have a feed going under that channel. So if you're talking about something, it gets so much easier to find the information you're looking for than if you have to go back and look through all your emails and try to find when were we talking about this online virtual program. It just makes it a little easier form of communication. And as far as meetings, I have found that works best for me is to make sure all my staff know that they are to speak at the meeting and report on what they're doing, how things are working for them, and any programs or ideas that they have, and everybody shares at all of our staff meetings as well.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm looking at the clock, Julie, so we're gonna, I don't know, we either have to talk faster or something, so okay. All right, so the next thing, I guess maybe we can breeze over this a little bit, because you do have samples of evaluations in that packet that you're going to get after the meeting. But evaluations, again, civil service has some requirements with regard to the probationary period. At my library, because our probationary period is 3 months, we do an evaluation at the end of that 3 months, and then we do one annually after that. Julie and I talked about the fact that over our careers, we've changed the forms that we've used many times. Julie says because she gets bored with them. I feel the same way. I've used more of like a checklist form in the past, and I find that it really just isn't that helpful to me. So I've now switched to a much more open-ended type of evaluation, where the staff member fills out a self-evaluation, and then I fill out an evaluation, and we kind of swap, and it's really more of a conversation about how they think they've done the past year, what they're proud of, and then what kind of goals. Then we talk a lot about, what would you like to maybe take on? What do you do? Would you need more training? How would you be able to accomplish this? So by using the open-ended one, I have found that our evaluations turn into more of a conversation as opposed to just me saying, okay, yeah, you did that good. So you'll see those forms in there. Julie, did you have anything you wanted to share about evaluations?
No, I the same as you. I like the open-ended one much better. As far as with new employees, I do informal evaluations throughout their time. Every week or so, I'll check in with them, and then they get a formal evaluation after 6 months, and then another one before they're permanently appointed after a year, and then annually after that.
Okay. All right, so now we get to the not fun slide, the termination or separation. I mean, separate, it could just be that someone is resigning because they got a great job and they want to move on. But in either case, the important thing to know about termination is that you need to make sure that you know the law and that you know the protected classes. In New York State, there is a handout in your packet that has a list of the protected classes. Doesn't mean that you can't terminate someone who's in a protected class, but you have to be very careful, and you certainly would want to take a partner. And the two partners that I would always take would be my board, personnel committee, and my attorney if I was in a situation where I felt like I needed to terminate someone. If you're doing the feedback component of human resources properly, then really terminations, getting to this point shouldn't be a surprise to the employee, because if they've been told that they need to improve and they've been given deadlines for improvement, they should really understand that that there's a chance they're going to lose their job because you've had that conversation with them. It's been an ongoing conversation. Julie and I both talked about the fact that frequently counseling can lead an employee to realize that it's really not a good fit, and they end up resigning rather than putting you in a position of having to terminate them. So that again goes back to that feedback. If you really need to make sure you're having those conversations with people, because that's the way that you can make it so that the library really doesn't take on a risk. For me, I have just started using exit interviews, which is something different, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But an exit interview is something I use when someone resigns and I kind of want to get feedback from them. And now Julie's going to cover the wonderful civil service rules with regard to termination.
Yes. So as I mentioned previously, during probation, that is the only time that you can terminate a competitive person, a competitive employee, without following the rule of three. After that person has been made a permanent appointment, if it's a competitive, there is a three-step process that needs to be followed. The first offense, they get a verbal notification. After that, it's a written warning. And then the third one, they get a hearing where they can be charged, they have to be charged with the misconduct under Civil Service Section C-75, which is where the hearing, that's when they get to the hearing, and they only can be removed if they are found guilty at that hearing. So it's very important that you document, even when you have the verbal warning, that you make sure you note, you met with so-and-so on this date, at this time, this was discussed, and that everything is shared with your board or your personnel committee and your attorney right from the beginning, so that everyone is in the loop. There'll be no surprises. The lawyer can help you to make sure that you are following civil service laws correctly, because you do not want to make a mistake with this. Like, I've never had to go through this, so I'm fortunate in that regard. There are instances when you can have an immediate filing without going through the three steps, which would be thefts, violence, insubordination, alcohol or drug use at work, failure to perform, or ongoing attendance issues, and failure to come to work. And again, all of that needs to be documented. In civil service, it is so important to have this trail of paperwork everywhere, and to make sure that your board and your attorney are involved right from the beginning of any of these instances. And for more information on all the civil service information, NYLA Task Force put together a great guide, which can be found on the NYLA website, and I think that the link may be included on one of the slides or with our.
Yeah, I think it was in their program guide.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, good.
Yeah, so, okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we're getting close to the end, so it's good that we're on exit interviews. This is my last slide, so we'll have a little time for questions. As I said before, exit interviews is not something that I had done in the past, but I've started doing them when people resign. And I have a sample exit interview in the packet as well. But basically, it's just to kind of find out why people are leaving, and to get some specifics, whether it has to do with salary or benefits or the number of hours they were given. And then also find out what they liked about the job, what they didn't like about the job, if there's things that they would recommend that the library do in the future for staff members. What I have found this is helpful for is it goes back to the thing that I said about the your library system providing you with comparative information, and that's helpful information to give your personnel committee so that you can be competitive when you're looking to hire. I feel that this is another piece of that puzzle. It helps the personnel committee understand, you know, is this a good place to work? Do people want to work here? Do people feel supported? What kinds of things can we do to make it a better work environment? Because obviously the goal is to be able to hire the best people for the job. And the way to do that is to make it a workplace that people want to be at. So that's what the exit interview can do for you. So I hope that you've gotten something out of this. As I said, there's a lot of handouts. So I think Becky, when I had to send them to her, I had so many that she had to do it a special way for us. So, you know, you've got to have a lot of goodies there to look through. This has our contact information, and, you know, we're happy to have you contact us if you have questions. I don't know, Christina, if you have questions in the chat box or.
Well, thank you both so much for this really informative and amazing presentation. Everyone has really loved everything so far. So I've been monitoring that. So we do have a few questions that came in. And just as a reminder, to send over a question, you could either raise your hand and ask it live by clicking participants and then clicking raise hand, and then I'll unmute you. Or you can put it in the chat. So we're going to start with the chat ones first. So the first question is from Jennifer Russell from Saugerties Public Library District. Does ADP deal with New York State retirement?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. Yes, they would. Well, I've sent in the payment with ADP, but ADP knows the percentage that needs to be taken out of the employee's a paycheck. But they don't send New York State retirement the funds. That I still do that part of it. So Jennifer, you can call me anytime too.
Thank you. So we both have a question from Lori from Newburgh Free Library. How does one get trained to be a trainer? Like, how can we be better at onboarding and training our staff?
Oh.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think you have to do a lot of research into ways to teach, really, because I mean, training is really teaching. So you might do some research to give yourself some information with regard to your style of teaching. But I think the other thing that's really important is it's really important to understand the job that you are training for, and really understanding all of the details and the things that might be difficult for people, so that you can make sure that you're sharing that information with them. But that's a really good question, and I think, again, it shows that you're actually thinking about it, and that's really the start of it, is to make sure that you are really thinking about, okay, what information do I need to impart to this person so that they can do the best, have the best possible experience. And it has to be specific to the job. I don't know, Julie, if you had some other thoughts on that.
No, I think that's great. It's a great question. I think just making sure that you have patience and understanding, which is all part of, teaching it, and making sure you take the time to clearly explain everything to the person, and make sure they are understanding it as you go through. Again, that's just, you learn about training. That's part of it as well. So.
Right. Yep.
Our next question is about the handouts. Just so everyone knows, all the handouts are actually already in the description. You'll see handouts, and at the link to a Google folder, that's where all the handouts are, and then also support links underneath it. So our next question is from Melanie from Alfred Box of Books Library. I recently learned about stay interviews. An exit interview is too late. The employee is already leaving. But a stay interview is for current employees. What makes them stay? What can we improve? What are we doing right?
That's great. It sounds kind of like evaluations, but a little different. Because it's not just evaluating their job. It's asking how they relate to the.
Right. I've never actually thought about that. I think that because my evaluation is more of a conversation, a lot of times that is something that comes into it. It's like, you know, are you in, and I think Julie alluded to it as well when she said that she does a lot of checking in with her staff. So it's kind of the same thing, but I never thought of actually calling it a stay interview. That's
Right.
a good idea.
Our next question is from Chris from the Waverly Free Library. How has COVID and the changing library landscape changed how you determine job descriptions, evaluations, and et cetera?
How has it, I'm sorry, I didn't hear,
How
how
has
it changed?
How has COVID and the changing library landscape changed how you determine job descriptions and evaluations?
That's good.
Yeah, you go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I don't know that it changed the job description so much. I know when staff was working remotely, which was easier obviously for some staff than others. So for my clerks, then they had to learn, you know, there was other things involved, I guess. So that's how it changed. It wasn't the description itself. They had to, you know, make sure they knew every resource. They would go online and take tutorials and try them out and things like that, just to make sure that, you know, the board was willing to keep their salaries, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody was doing a little something. So because we are taxpayer based.
Yes.
So I guess in that regard, now we're on split shifts in our library, even though we're only a staff of 12, like Carol, with 13 with my laborer. So we have only 4 on at a time, and then 2 in a branch. I have a branch as well. Because if someone does test positive, I didn't want the whole staff being exposed. So it's made that a little different. So I guess I guess in that regard, then I've added things that they can do from home to their job descriptions that maybe they had not had previously. So, and then with evaluations, they'll be evaluated on those new things that they had to do. Obviously, it's hard to evaluate them on something they weren't able to do for the year. In fact, my board decided not to do evaluations. As a school district, we go from July to June, so our evaluations are usually done the beginning of June, and the board said not to do them this past year because of COVID, because it would not, first of all, I couldn't sit down with staff to do the evaluations, and they just felt that with everything else going on, it was not a time to do them. So this is the first year we have not done staff evaluations.
Okay.
Yeah. We do have one hand raised, and I'll have this be the last question. But for those who did have some in the chat, I encourage you to also reach out to Carol and Julie via either email or through the networking tab. You can search them up and ask your questions in there. So let me unmute Corinne.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
My question is, it's really kind of a question comment kind of thing. You guys did a great job, by the way. The comment is, when you're in insurance and fundraising should be part of the questions that you ask your insurance. Do you have any comment on that premise?
Fundraising should be something that we should ask the insurance company. As I want to be clear on your question.
Correct. When you're out and about, that's another, I've found in my past experiences that that's something that really should be addressed when you're fundraising. Say you're leaving, doing a hot dog roast in the parking lot, for example.
Right.
That kind of thing they should be made aware of. Do you have any comment?
Absolutely. And again, you know, a lot of this, a lot of human resources goes back to communication. I mean, that's really a big part of it. You have to be good at communicating with all those members of your human resources team, and you have to be good at communicating with your staff. And that's what eliminates confusion and also surprises, which, you know, legal surprises nobody wants. So thanks for pointing that out, Corinne.
You're welcome.
So that's the end of this program. And if you do have any additional questions, feel free to use both their emails or do the chat function in the virtual conference. Thank you both so much for doing this program. It was so informative. Everyone loved it.
Thank you.
And about, because I know we got one more question about the Google folder. The Google folder is in the description. It's a link. It doesn't look like a link, but if you hover over it, it is. And that's where you can access all the materials that we talked about. But yeah, all right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Julie, my
Oh,
civil service guru.
Carol.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Have a
Bye.
good conference, everyone.
Yes.